So Travis asked me to speak as was introduced on using corn silage in both background as well as in cow-calf rations. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about some of the thinking that goes into putting together rations in both of these segments, look at some of the feeds that we have available to us, and then I'll kind of focus in on using corn. So, you know, whether we're feeding beef cows, whether we're feeding fat cattle, whether we're feeding backgrounding cattle, we really want to put together a nutrition program that meets the needs of the animals for whatever level of production that we want, and we want to do it in an economical fashion. Right? So it doesn't matter what class of cattle we're feeding. We want them to have the right nutrients for the right stage of production and do it as cheap as we can. So when you think about why we're feeding these cattle, what do they need from their own biological perspective? First of all, they need it for maintenance. So particularly last February, January, maintenance needs of those beef cows were probably at an all-time high with that cold weather, right? So maintenance is just keeping the animal alive, keeping them warm, letting them get up to the feed trough or out into a field somewhere to graze. That's their basic requirements for life. And then we've got to feed them for production levels, whether it's growth in backgrounding cattle, growth in bred heifers, 2-year-old heifers, lactation, and pregnancy. All of those production aspects require nutrients, whether it's energy, protein, etc. So we have to meet the maintenance requirements first, then we have to come in and meet whatever level of production we're looking at. So what are we concerned about in terms of nutrients? Energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, as well as water. You don't want to forget about water. I'm going to probably focus mostly on energy here today, a little bit on protein. But when you start to think about some of these other ones, I think probably one of the most important aspects you can look at in a cow-calf operation is your mineral program. More often than not, when people come to you with problems with open cows or they can't get their heifers bred, it comes back to some type of a mineral problem. Okay? So it's extremely important aspects of nutrition. So when we talk about energy, you want to remember that your cattle eat to meet their energy needs. We often think about protein as being the most important nutrient. It's the most costly nutrient to supply if we're going to go out and buy it in a protein supplement, etc. But when you think about what animals are eating, they're really eating energy. And if you've got cows out there right now that are eating, just say for easy calculation, 22 pounds of dry matter, roughly half of that is going to be energy, probably a little bit more at this time of the year. So more than half of it's going to be energy, only 1.5 pounds or maybe 2 pounds of it is going to be protein. So the vast majority of it is going to be energy. So they're eating to meet their energy needs. When we look at mature cows, they're typically going to eat somewhere between 1 3/4 and 2 1/4% of their body weight on a dry matter basis. And when we're talking silage versus hay-based diets, we really need to think about the moisture content in the feeds that we're feeding them. If we look at a 1,400-pound cow at this range of 1 3/4 to 2 1/4% of body weight on a dry matter basis, that means that cow is going to eat somewhere between 24 and 35 pounds of dry matter. Okay? If we look at that as hay put up at 87% dry matter, that means she's going to eat between 28 and 40 pounds of hay, okay, to meet that range. If we actually let her have all the amount of silage that she wanted to eat at 35% dry matter, you're up to 68 to 90 pounds, right? So that's the difference. You're supplying the same amount of dry matter, 24 to 35 pounds of dry matter, but look at the difference between a hay-based diet to meet that dry matter versus the silage, right? It's a huge difference, and it's all water. Right? Forage quality will have an impact on what the animal can eat. Okay, so if we look at poor quality forage, straw-based diets, typically you want to limit the intake of straw to about 1.25% of body weight. You look at a medium quality hay, a grass hay, somewhere between 1.5 to 1.75% of body weight. And if you've got a very good quality forage, an alfalfa grass hay, that animal is going to be able to eat more of that, up to 2.25% of her body weight, simply because it's digested to a greater extent in the rumen. Passage weight through the rumen is quicker, so physically she can eat more of it. Okay? Often we don't need to feed them that much, simply because those high quality forages will have more energy, more protein than what they need, so we limit it, right? So as an example, barley straw, this is our 1,400 pound cow. Lots of cows are fed straw this winter, right? Barley straw at 1.25% of body weight is going to be 18 pounds of dry matter and roughly 20 pounds as fed. That cow would probably eat more of that. But if that straw was free choice, and we got into situations like we were in January, February with that real cold weather, and they're going to go to that feed trough or that bale feeder to eat more, they're going to pile that straw in, and the chances of impaction are pretty severe. So that's why you have a recommendation of no more than 1.25% of body weight. You don't want to get impacted cows. If we look at grass hay at that 1.5 to 1.75% of body weight on a dry matter basis, that's between 21 and 25 pounds of dry matter. And as fed, they could eat 24 to 28 pounds of that hay. Then as you move to a higher quality hay, a more digestible hay, again, we wouldn't need to feed them that much, but they can eat it more because of the digestibility of it. So forage quality is very important in terms of the amount these animals can eat. Cold stress will also have a big impact on it. So 10 to 20% increase in intake because of cold stress. And that's where you can get into situations with impaction if you're not providing a concurrent source of a relatively high energy feed along with it, such as barley grain or digestible forage. Prior to calving, we'll see intakes drop a little bit, just prior to calving, simply because of the size limitations because of the calf and the fetal fluids. And then post-calving, intake will pick up pretty quick. So there's a lot of factors that will influence what cows are eating and how much they'll eat. So energy is required in the largest amounts, and while price per pound, it's not the most expensive nutrient. When you look at the amount she's eating, it is the most costly nutrient that we're supplying to these animals. And it's important. It keeps them alive, keeps them productive, pregnant, growing, milking. So what are some of the factors that influence energy requirements? Age of the animal. You know, we got a calf there, we got probably just guessing, a 3 or 4 year old bull, we got a 8-year-old cow there. All those ages are going to be influenced by, or going to influence their energy requirements. Body weight is probably the biggest factor. Body weight influences or really determines how much energy is needed for maintenance. That's how we calculate it when we do energy predictions. We look at the weight of the animal and we put it into an equation that gives us how many megacalories of energy is required per kilogram of body weight. Body condition will have a big factor on it, and then the level of production that we expect. So I'll use this cow as I go through here with some of the examples. And so this 1,400 pound cow, it's amazing how they change. I used to do these presentations, they were 1,100 to 1,200 pound cows right now. Maybe 5 years from now, they're going to be, I don't know, 1,700 pound cows. They're probably 1,700 pound cows now. So 1,400 pound cows, second trimester, so we're going to calve her in mid-May, so she's bred August 1st, roughly. Second trimester, that puts her November through the end of January. Okay, so that's when she was going through second trimester. So she's in good condition. Temperature is not very stressful on her. What she needs in terms of energy to basically maintain herself, because that's all she's doing at that point in time, is about 13 pounds of TDN, probably between 12 and 13 pounds of TDN and she needs about 1.5 pounds of protein a day. Okay. So when we start to move from that second trimester at the end of January, basically now into a period where February, March, so February would be 7th month of pregnancy. March, where we're here now, is the 8th month of pregnancy. Next month is 9 months of pregnancy, and then she's going to calve. Right? So as we get into this last period here, when we look at the last 6 to 8 weeks prior to calving, that's when probably 70% of the growth of the fetus is going to happen, and we're going to see energy requirements increase over and above that 13 pounds that I just had. We're going to see 15 to 30% increase in energy requirements as we go through the 8th and 9th month of pregnancy. We're going to see protein increase, her protein requirements increase from 20 to 30%, as well as the certain minerals like calcium, vitamin requirements will increase as well. So that's the time period that this animal is in right now. Probably many of your cows are in right now as you're calving in May and June. Those are the types of increases in requirements that she's experiencing. And then as she goes from calving through breeding, you're concerned about lactation, you're concerned about her coming back into heat and rebreeding, and you can see because of lactation that you've got a further increase in energy requirements of about 25% on top of what we just saw, as well as continued increases in protein and mineral requirements. So these are really two critical periods that we talk about in terms of meeting the nutrient requirements of the animal. If we fail to meet these requirements that we're moving into right now with that animal, she's gonna continue to develop that calf inside her. She'll use the fat off her back. She'll break down protein in her muscles. She'll use calcium from her skeletal structure to meet the requirements for that fetus. So she'll lose condition. She'll lose body weight. If it's severe enough, you can see an increase in abortions. Severe enough, you'll see reduction in birth weights. That's not a good way to get a low birth weight calf. There's other ways to do it. And probably most characteristically, she's going to be slow to come back into heat after calving. Right? If the nutrients aren't good enough prior to calving, she's going to be in no hurry to come back into heat after calving. And similarly, if you fail to meet the needs of lactation, she's going to lose weight because she's going to milk for that calf on her side. Whether you feed her or not, she's going to try to supply that calf with milk, but she'll lose capacity to produce milk. The calf will lose gain. Again, you'll see effects on reproduction. So, you know, the real message, the real message behind developing wintering programs for your cows is you want to minimize weight loss, particularly during that time frame in the last trimester of pregnancy and from calving through pasture turnout. What other factors influence energy requirements? Well, certainly body fat scores, body condition scores of your animals, as well as the environment. And when we look at condition scores of the animals, I think Bart talked about it a little bit. It's probably one of the best tools that we have to be able to group cows according to their nutritional requirements. So if we look at cows that are in good body condition, typically a condition score of 3 or 3.5, really over the winter, right through calving, they just need to maintain their weight over the winter. As long as we can maintain their condition, don't have them lose excessively prior to calving, we can develop feeding programs relatively low-cost feeding programs to get them through the winter. This group here, bred replacement heifers, second calf heifers. These are probably the animals that are most difficult, particularly the second calf heifers, to get them to keep on track and to get them to rebreed in a short period of time. And that's because they're not just undergoing the stress of pregnancy, they're not just undergoing the stress of the environment, particularly that we just saw. but they're also growing. And if we can't put a ration in front of them that meets their requirements for maintenance, for growth, as well as for pregnancy, they're just going to be slow in coming back into heat afterwards. So this is a group that doesn't really compete very well with mature cows, and so if we can feed them separately and develop a separate ration for them, that's a good way to go about it. And the third group that we've got here would be thin and older cows. Again, they're not going to compete. You want to put weight on them over the winter, and so feeding them with the mature cows that are in good condition typically doesn't work as well. If they can be fed separately, fine. If not, feed them with that second group that I had up there already. And the effects of cold weather, a rule of thumb that I always use is 1 pound more grain for every 5 degrees Celsius below -20. And so when you're at -35, you're looking at 3 to 4 pounds more grain, and that's just for maintenance energy needs. That's not keeping the animal growing, that's not keeping them lactating, anything like that. It's just meeting their requirements, extra maintenance requirements because of the cold weather. So, you know, the take-home message on the cow-calf side is certainly account for the changing energy needs of your cattle with stage of pregnancy, growth, and lactation. So let's look at the backgrounding side of things and some of the things that we would look for in putting together a program with respect to backgrounding cattle. When we look at calves that are produced across Saskatchewan, across Western Canada, when we look at them at weaning, depending on their weight, depending on their frame size, they're going to either be backgrounded over the winter for grass next spring. They'll be backgrounded over the winter for that would be sold to a feedlot in the spring and go from there into a finishing program. So these guys basically are, when they're marketed in the fall as long yearlings. These guys get marketed in the spring basically as short yearlings. That's 12 months of age, roughly 12 to 14 months of age. Okay. And then there's a group that probably goes direct to finishing. So from a backgrounding perspective, these are the two groups that we're concerned about. And when we look at the type of operations that are out there, if they're going to be backgrounded, they're going to be grown out to a defined target weight. And that really just depends on your goals as the owner of those cattle and what your marketing goals are for them. So there's a large group of calves that are going to be backgrounded over the winter that they're destined for grass in the spring. So people are buying them either in the fall and backgrounding them over the winter and they put them out in grass, or in some cases they're bought early in late winter, early spring, backgrounded for a short period of time, and then they go to grass. But basically they're going to go to grass at somewhere around 650 to 750 in terms of weight. And then that group that is backgrounded over the winter and ended up in the feedlot in the spring, they're taking the heavier weights, they're pushed harder in the backgrounding program. So the type of program you've got is going to differ depending on where you want those animals to end up. So if we look at backgrounding these calves for grass, basically the type of program you'd look at is taking calves that are anywhere from 350 to 500 pounds typically. The target weight is 650 to 750. And so your gains over the winter are probably somewhere in that 1.5 pounds. And it probably varies from 1.25 pounds, although you're almost starving them at 1.25 pounds. It's hard to get them that low. But 1.5 pounds to 1.75 pounds, just depending upon on what your goals are. So if they're going to go to grass in mid-May through September, at this weight, the target gain on grass is somewhere between 1.75 and 2 pounds a day. And so they end up coming off grass at 18 months of age or so, somewhere around 900 to 1,000 pounds. Those ones that are purchased here in the spring, maybe they're early spring, so February, March, and then they're backgrounded for a short period of time to go to grass. They're a little heavier, but basically they've got the same type of program, and they end up pretty much in the same weight as long yearlings. The other group that would be backgrounded for the feedlot in the spring, so they come into, they're going to be backgrounded in the fall at, you know, typically 550 to 650 pounds, so they're heavier than this other group that goes to grass, probably a little more growth potential to them. Their target weight in the spring is anywhere in that neighborhood, 850 to 900 pounds. And, you know, just depending on the type of calf they are, you're going to be backgrounding them at 2 to 2.5 pounds a day. So you've got a backgrounding program that might want 1.5 pounds a day. You've got a backgrounding program that might want 2.5 pounds a day. So you've got to have different rations to be able to do that. So, you know, a real key to setting up a backgrounding program is to know the weight of the calf that you've got, when your starting date is, what's your target endpoint in terms of your finishing that backgrounding program, you know, when are you going to market them? And in this case, from November 1st to March 15th, you got 135 days. You got 300 pounds of gain you're putting on them. So you divide the 300 by the 135, and you got to set up a backgrounding program that basically is going to give you 2.25 pounds a day gain to get your target, right? So that's what your nutrition program has to focus on. So when we look at the different types of sources of feeds that we've got out there to meet some of the energy protein needs of these animals, certainly the cereal grains are the feed sources that have the most energy density to them. When we look at corn here, which is basically the king or the queen, however you want to refer to it, in terms of energy, at 88 to 90% TDN, relatively low protein levels, and then you go down through wheat, barley, and oats, and you can see that the TDN is dropping in a relatively linear fashion here, whereas the protein is relatively constant between 11 and 13% or so, with wheat sometimes having a little bit higher levels. But certainly these cereal grains are the primary source of energy and that we would have access to. And when you look at finishing rations, of course, they're 80–90% cereal grains, and that's because they need energy to get the 3.5–4.5 pounds a day gain in those rations. Background in rations, we have to limit the inclusion of these so we can control the rate of gain. When we look at a lot of the forages that are out there, the hay, so when we look at alfalfa grass hay, the inclusion of legumes are going to get us a relatively good energy content to them, certainly a higher protein content. The variation that you see in here is really going to be reflective of the stage of cutting. So the more mature the forage, the more mature the cutting, the lower the TDN content, as well as the lower the protein content. We come down to some of our grasses, and you can see that there's a drop in the energy content of those grasses. When we look at some of the green feeds there, oat, barley, green feed, typically between 57 and 60% TDN and 10, maybe 11% protein. Standing corn, as Bart showed, can be anywhere from 60 to 65% TDN, and in some cases higher, with somewhere around 8% protein, and some of our specialty forages can be very similar to our green feeds. If we look at the silages, and I'm going to talk more about corn silage here in a minute, you can see, again, when we look at a legume silage, you've got a very high protein level to it, and an intermediate energy level. Barley can vary pretty significantly in terms of its energy content for silage, depending on a lot of factors with respect to when it's cut, kernel filling as well, stage of maturity, etc. And corn being a relatively higher energy content than the other sources of silage. But I'll talk more detail about that in a second. And then finally, we've got the straws that, again, a lot of it was used this winter, but we're dealing with relatively low energy content in these straws relative to these other forage sources, and low protein sources, right? So if you're looking at feeding straw-based diets, you really have to recognize that you need to supplement energy, you need to supplement protein, you need to supplement minerals, and you need to supplement vitamins. You have to supplement everything. So why corn silage? Okay, so we've heard a little bit about that through the day here already. Certainly these, when you look at these early maturing varieties that we now have access to, you're starting to see corn silage growing. As far as Bart showed a picture of Mike Bartlett up at Big River, Saskatchewan. We've been growing up corn up there for a number of years. You're seeing it in Spiritwood area, you're seeing it over in the Yorkton area. Of course, you're seeing it down south, you're seeing it here, you're seeing it all over the province, right? And that's because of these new earlier maturing varieties. And really the impetus that when I talk to producers about it is that they're looking at corn relative to barley silage and other silages is because of the potential for increased forage dry matter yields, as well as the higher feed energy content to it, right? So if we can get everything right with corn, we're going to get higher yields, and we're going to get a higher energy feed source. And from background in operations perspective, cow-calf operations perspective, feedlot perspective, that's what they're after with it, right? Makes great silage, you put it up at the right stage, you put it at the right moisture content, very high quality silage, you pack it right, you cut it right, etc. You can get very high quality silage out of it. Again, that's a big plus for it. No further processing, you got to process the kernels, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. You have to process the kernels, but once it's in that pit and chopped, no further processing is required. You're not setting up a tub grinder, you're not worrying about rolling, etc. It's a nice situation in that perspective. Guaranteed feed inventory, again, it's a big reason why I hear people using corn silage. And again, it's been talked about here, recycling nutrients and fed the cattle back out into the field, etc. So all of this doesn't just apply to corn silage, right? So I could go through this list, and some of these factors are also going to apply to barley silage, right? So it's just not all corn silage. And there are disadvantages that I see anyways from a nutrition point of view with growing corn silage. And I think Travis is probably going to talk a little bit more about this following this, but there's, you know, you chase that yield, dry matter yield, it's going to come at a cost. And you want to make sure that balance that you have in terms of higher yield, higher energy content is outweighing the higher cost of putting that corn in relative to what you could be growing otherwise. And this is the big one, right? We can get corn heat units, and we can map out where every location is in Saskatchewan, what the corn heat unit is for that location. And we can probably get a variety that will match that. But that doesn't mean that we're going to get the moisture and the heat that's needed to develop that crop, right? It's variable, and we have no control on that. You guys have a little bit of control on it here. If you're growing it under irrigation, you can control the moisture. But as I think I just heard, 18 was different than 17 in this area in terms of corn heat units, and it affected the crop, right? So that is a big issue that I see with producers around the province, and I'll show you that in a minute. So we can't always guarantee that we're going to get the moisture and the heat. This leads to variation in yield, and it leads to variation in silage quality. So lack of adequate growing degree days will lead to immature kernel filling, and immature kernel filling leads to reduced starch content of that silage, and that leads to lower energy content of the silage, right? So it's just a fact of life that if you're going to grow corn, you've got to make sure you're growing a variety that is suited for your area. Okay? And even then, it doesn't always work out to the best of, or to our satisfaction, I guess. And you do need to harvest the kernel at harvest. You look at some of these varieties that are out there, there's flint varieties and there is dent varieties, right? And the flint varieties, basically the difference between those is the nature of the starch, the vitreousness of the starch. It's a much harder starch in the flint varieties. And when those kernels are filling, you don't get the shrinkage in the starch granules that you see with the dent, and they form a hard layer over under the cap. And particularly with the flint varieties, you should do it with the dent as well, but you should have a kernel processor on your harvester just to make sure you're going to get as much digestibility out of those kernels as you can. Okay, so this is what I want to really highlight about what I see with different producers with corn in Saskatchewan. So hopefully you can see this. So this is corn silage taken from the Dairy One lab in New York. Okay, I looked on there, all of the corn silage analysis they have 250,000 samples of corn that's been analyzed in the last 10 or 15 years. And I took 2018. And their average dry matter content of the corn silage, so this is mostly coming in Ithaca, New York. Dairy producers been growing silage for years. They got varieties that are adapted to their regions. They would probably consider themselves the experts in growing corn silage, right? So if you look at the average dry matter content is about 34%. Range of, pretty good range. So they're putting some up at 27. So they might think they're the best corn silage producers in the world, but there's somebody down there that's not producing good corn silage, right? If they're putting it up at 27% dry matter, all the way up to 40%. Okay, crude protein 8.4, range 7.4 to 9.4. ADF, that's sort of the acid detergent fiber. That's in a forage, that's an indication of indigestibility. Higher the acid detergent fiber, the less digestible a forage is. Okay? So this case, 25%, a pretty tight range of 22 to 29%. Starch, that's what drives the energy value in corn, okay? In grains, period. But in corn, that's what's really driving the energy value. And it's about 32%. And again, there's a range there, but everything's over 25%. Okay, and here's the TDN at 72.4. That's kind of the sum of all these things, and a range of 69 to 76%. Here's corn silage in Saskatchewan in the last 2 years that I've worked with people and had their samples analyzed. Not a whole lot different in terms of the average dry matter content. So you can see the range here. Again, some people are putting it up too wet, and in one case it was put up way, way too dry, right? Crude protein, a little bit higher, but look at the range. Again, not